global governance and the current global governance deficit that we're facing, and the challenge to create a new global social contract. The unequal response to COVID-19, the slow progress that we're seeing today on climate action, and the recent invasion of Ukraine, all of these ongoing crises have demonstrated the failings of the intergovernmental system in maintaining world peace and sustainable development for all. As we head into COP27 and the G20 summit, we have to acknowledge that there is today an urgent need to build a new type of global collaboration. One that is hopeful, energizing, and maybe the most important thing, more effective in achieving fair outcomes for all. The UN Secretary General has made this very clear in his report on the common agenda released last year, which calls for a new social contract to make sure the world moves towards a breakthrough and not a breakdown of a system that is needed more than ever in today's crisis. We will discuss in our session what are the main gaps and challenges to global governance today, how can we rebuild confidence and trust towards multilateralism, and what should the new forms of multilateralism entail. Many people today would think that given the failure of the multilateral system, the solution is to be found elsewhere, maybe in national sovereignty or in smaller groups, or is it a reform at the UN or the G20 even possible? And what is the role of justice and access to it here? Why we focus on global governance? What does it mean for the local and national level? And last but not least, for every citizen. We should keep in mind that talking about global governance is not a lofty philosophical discussion, but in the end, the question is whether we're able to halt climate change, react more effectively to the next pandemic, help the 50 million or so people at the brink of starvation. We will start off our session with a video message from Mark Malloch-Brown, who's president of the Open Society Foundation, an organization that helps promote the values of justice, democracy, and human rights in over 120 countries throughout the world. And he previously served as vice president at the World Bank and also deputy secretary general of the United Nations, and also as minister in the British Brown government. Now over to Mark Malloch-Brown.
Hello, and great to join you all, and I'm sorry it's over video and not in person. Global governance, it's a big term. It's a term that automatically distances people from it. It doesn't seem to be about us and our lives. And yet, so many of our problems are indeed global. So building a world with the strong international systems and institutions that can address these global problems remains the challenge that it was for generations before us, the generations that created the United Nations after the Second World War, or the League of Nations after the First World War. That system needs rebooting, repurposing, remaking for a very, very changed world. And, you know, as a UN official myself, quite a while back, before many of you, I'm afraid to say, were probably born, I was one who, working for a remarkable, inspirational Secretary General, Kofi Annan, created the Millennium Development Goals. And it was a campaign blessed with some success, because by its end date in 2015, we had halved the amount of absolute poverty in the world. But since then, we've seen a series of declines and backtracking. So in that world, we need to build an international system that can work with governments and work with civil society, work indeed with business around the world, to mobilize the political will and the resources to tackle our shared problems. First is about the agenda, and it's got to be a campaigning agenda, not a passive one of just a charter for the organization, but something which goes to the heart of your discussions today around a social contract, a a commitment, if you like, by the different countries and peoples of the world to each other to collaborate and cooperate in a just system of global solidarity. A good place to start that agenda is with the proposals of the Prime Minister of a very small rocky outcrop island in the Caribbean, prone to hurricanes, only a couple of 100,000 inhabitants. But Mia Mottley has raised her voice, and it's resonated globally around a new deal for climate and development finance. Secondly, we have to deal with the issue, and this goes to the core of the social contract, of the ownership of the international system. It is currently still rests on the premises of 1945 and of the period of decolonization in the 1960s. It represents a power structure which is no more. We need now to move from a colonial to what I call a cooperative structure of much more equally shared ownership in decision making of these institutions, which is separated from financial contribution and is based on every state's voice being heard. But in order to do that, you have to also have a commitment to shared values. Unless it's built around that, distributed power will just become an excuse for distributed blockage and inaction. Countries will protect their own backyards. Countries allowed into the Security Council on a permanent or semi-permanent basis will demand the same colonial veto that the original powers had. On structure, the interstate nature of the system almost certainly is likely to remain the dominant structural form, but it needs to be added to it a large place and voice, an extra chamber, if you like, for civil society. And of course, one way of ensuring that that voice is representative is to make sure that the global South civil society has as much voice and presence as that of the global North. Finally, it's got to have not just the sort of mediator and standard setting roles of the old UN system, it's got to have a campaigning role. And so when member states gather in a specially convened meeting of the General Assembly to address the issue of the future, it's critical that they are presented with a vision which is a deeply inclusive one. So let me close with this appeal and proposal to you all. A global social contract which builds on the UN Charter, doesn't seek to replace it because we'll end up with less than we've got, almost certainly, but builds on it around a reimagined structure of the UN, of a more cooperative ownership base, of a large and formal space in it for civil society, for the private sector, which is going to be a critical mobilizer of resources to address our shared problems, not just the private sector of the West, or not just even the international private sector, but the small and medium-sized businesses that are a part of all our economies everywhere, as well as the national champions, which are so critical to a global economy which is more likely to be regionalized and localized than has been the case in recent generations. Bringing that structure together into a representative set of conversations and campaigns for global action is going to be a critical thing as we move forward. But above all, it must rest on the principle that while states are how we organize ourselves and are the primary means we engage between each other as citizens of those states, they must not obstruct wider engagement and more ambitious action. In polling that my organization, the Open Society Foundations, frequently does, we see that peoples are continuously more ambitious for the international system, more anxious to see action on climate change, more anxious to see protection for refugees, more anxious to see resources committed into economic recovery and a green transition than their governments. And we must keep that sense of ambition that comes from people's engagement primarily but not exclusively through their governments, and supplemented by a role and purpose for civil society in all of this. My late great boss, the great UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, used to say the Charter talks about not we the states of the UN, but we the peoples of the United Nations. So let us, we the peoples, gather our energy and our political will, apply it to our governments wherever we are, apply it to our civil society to make sure that we galvanize a repurposed UN, a repurposed international system. We need values and purpose, as well as widened membership, to drive global governance forward in an effective way. Thank you.
So Mark, Brown has laid out already a very ambitious agenda, which I think is a good start into our discussion, and a lot of points to take away. I think we need a campaign, we need new decision making, we need more inclusivity, we need an extra chamber for civil society, but I think maybe most importantly, we need to be at least as ambitious as citizens want us to be. And now I'm turning to our panel. So I'm joined by 4 eminent panelists. And I want to start with His Excellency President Turk, who doesn't need much of an introduction. He was president of Slovenia from 2007 to 2012, but also served as first Slovene permanent representative to the United Nations. He was also a member of the UN Human Rights Committee and served as UN Assistant Secretary General. And today he's the president of the Club de Madrid, and I'm sure that the Club de Madrid also has an agenda to rebuild this social contract. President Turk, based on your experience, how has trust in governance, public action, in particular multilateral action, evolved over the last decades? And most importantly, what is the Club de Madrid? What are you proposing today to counter the different crises that we're facing? Just to mention the food, the energy, the debt, the climate crisis, all of which obviously lead to greater social exclusion and that we need to overcome today. President Turk, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers for allowing me, for making it possible for me to say a few words and participate in the panel. I think that the global governance deficit is a major problem today, and the global town hall meeting is an important innovative form in which the world can address these issues. We have to take advantage of the new possibilities that technology gives us and organize a worldwide discussion of the type that we are participating in right now. Now, we just heard the opinion of Mark Mellor-Brown, a friend from my days in the United Nations. I worked with Kofi Annan at about the same time, and of course, we spent much of our energy in trying to develop an activist campaigning agenda of that era, some 20 years ago. And clearly the problem is such that we need the same today. We need a new activist campaigning agenda for the future. But we also need a very clear diagnosis. Obviously, the level of trust has diminished in the past 20 years, especially since 2011, and if I want to be more precise, I would say since the destruction of Libya. I mean, that was a political event that triggered a lot of further events that, in a cumulative sense, destroyed the international trust. But of course, behind that, there is a bigger problem of the international community, and that is the ongoing changes in the power relations in the world. We have to be aware of that. The world is no longer dominated by a single power or by a group of Western powers. There are other actors on the scene, and they want their say. And of course, that's a major factor of deteriorating international decision-making, and as a result, the lack of trust which is now prevailing. I do not wish to say that the new powers are somehow responsible for any negative effect. With equal argument, one can say that the dominating powers of the past do not wish to accept any changes. And unless things change in the power centers in the Western powers, obviously this will be very difficult to establish a new and more organized, better functioning international community. But this is not going to happen overnight, and it is not going to happen automatically. Therefore, citizens' initiatives, mobilization, and activist and also campaigning agenda is very necessary. I believe that the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, today realized that, and that's why he produced a very ambitious report, Our Common Agenda, which is about an agenda, really, and in which he argued in favor of changes, including developing a new social contract, which of course is a very ambitious objective. Now, what needs to be done in order to come closer to that objective? There is a variety of tasks, and we, former presidents and prime ministers organized in Club de Madrid, have proposed several things, and I don't have the time to elaborate on all of them. So I will choose just two examples. Obviously, the structure of the United Nations, our most general, most common organization, has to change. And we are arguing in favor of using one of the charter provisions, which allows convening of a global conference that would review the system and make the changes, make proposals for changes that states will have to accept. But that, of course, can come only at a later stage. What is the most pressing today is the climate agenda. Here, the world is facing an existential threat, a threat to the world's existence. And I think all civil societies of the world have to mobilize to create a climate agenda which would be adequate. In the past, it was felt that $100 billion annually would suffice to move process towards decarbonization by 2050. Today, we know that this is not going to be sufficient. Much more is needed. But whatever is needed today will be richly repaid afterwards. And that realization has not yet sunk in the minds of decision makers. Here is the critical point at which I think our activism should be geared. Of course, I could talk, and I will later on also, about World Social Summit, but if one want to talk about the agenda, the critical point of the agenda is climate and the need to find a more effective way to deal with climate issues and to ensure decarbonization by 2050 or about that time. So that would be my initial contribution. Of course, I will come in later with other ideas. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, President Türk. I think we're hearing again the need for an activist campaigning agenda, and also that change is not coming overnight and needs citizen engagement, but at the same time that we had this urgency with climate action. And I can only support this. We're not having here a theoretical debate. Global governance is urgently needed, in particular to address this climate change challenge. I'm now turning to Professor Harsh Pant, who's Vice President of Studies and Foreign Policy at Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi. And he also holds positions at King's College London and as a director at the Delhi School of Transnational Affairs at Delhi University. And his academic career included positions at the University of Pennsylvania, McGill, the Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, DC, and also the University of Melbourne. And Professor, maybe we can take a step back. President Türk already mentioned some of the causes maybe of today's state of multilateral affairs, for instance, mentioning Libya as a turning point. What is your take on why the global multilateral order is such in such a sorry state today. And when we spoke about the panel earlier, you mentioned this emergence of new minilaterals, you called them, trying to fill the void we're facing today in terms of multilateralism. But are these minilaterals the solution, or what are you suggesting to overcome the structural challenges we're meeting today? Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Federica, and thank you to the organizers for having me as part of this very, very important conversation. And as you said, this is not simply a matter of theory, and this is a matter of real, in real time problems that we are facing, and our inability to manage most of them, in fact. And what is striking is that global governance, especially at a time when it is most needed, it is found missing in action. We have seen that in particular with what happened in the during the COVID crisis. I mean, there was a time when we used to say as academics that, look, health security is a soft power issue, or a softer issue, soft security issue. States find it easier to cooperate on soft issues, and therefore, health or issues like pertaining to those, pertaining to non-traditional security would find it easier. States would come to each other easily, and therefore multilateral institutions are better at managing them. But look what happened to WHO and WHO's response during COVID. Absolutely abysmal response from in the initial period, and then we have seen how power politics has shaped the responses of platforms of global governance architecture. We have had problems not only in WHO, we have had problems in WTO, we have had problems at the larger level in the UN Security Council, where the power disparities, power balance, the emerging balance of power is making it almost impossible now to find consensus among major powers. And I think that's a real story, that we are at an inflection point in global politics, and there is I don't think there is any any way you can ignore that part of the reality. We were discussing earlier that there was a very interesting debate on autocracies versus democracies as part of this town hall, and I think that tells you the story of our times, that we are living in a highly fractured and polarized world. And unless, and I don't know if using the word like international community serves any purpose anymore, because there are multiple communities of interests emerging, and they are looking at things from very different polarized perspectives. Now, the issue is, how can we bring some of these communities together to at least tackle some of the challenges, for example, climate change. Now, I mean, as an academic, I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic here, because it's what has happened over the last decade, and where the trend lines are going doesn't give you confidence that the ability of the existing institutional architecture is there to make some of these challenges possible. I would add another issue here, which is, there is an emerging maritime geography called the Indo-Pacific. Now, the term Indo-Pacific was not part of the policy lexicon 5 years back. Suddenly, everyone is talking about Indo-Pacific. Now, even in the Indo-Pacific, you have countries that are yet to reconcile with the word Indo-Pacific. So you can imagine a situation where you are looking at regions and where there is a need for regional governance, and where regional governance is missing because key stakeholders do not recognize those geographies as some do. So we have a fundamental problem here in terms of the underlying structural realities of global politics shaping our understanding. And I think what we have seen over a period of time is emerging technologies. The changing nature of technology has allowed communities of shared interest to develop across countries, across boundaries, and that has had a great impact on certain issue areas where the youth of the world has the possibility of coming together without worrying about their distances, boundaries. They've formed communities, they've shared communities, and they've talked about issues, and where you have state policies are being impacted by what global citizens in some ways can do about certain things. And there, I think that model in some ways is being replicated at the state level, which you talked about, minilaterals. in the absence of multilateral platforms, what we are witnessing now is that states, like-minded countries, like-minded nations are increasingly trying to come together and form functional bonds. So you have issues, for example, let's take maritime security in the Indo-Pacific. You have like-minded countries that will come together and say, well, we will work together towards this end. Then you will have certain countries that are again that look at certain issues through a certain lens that will say we will talk about health and environment. But what is interesting is that even issues that at one point we thought would bring countries together, like trade and technology cooperation, are being weaponized. Are being polarized. So in the past, the idea was that let's trade and become friends. Now we are talking about in an era of deglobalization, let's trade among friends. So let's think about supply chains differently. Let's think about trade differently. Let's think about technology cooperation differently. And I think that's going to have a great impact on the way nations approach each other. And I'm afraid if that is the perspective, then that void that multilateral order is facing is being filled by these like-minded coalitions. And these coalitions, of course, have their own problems, because of their non-inclusive nature, because of their limited approach to certain problems. They are not there to solve bigger problems, broader problems. They are there to solve small functional problems. And so by definition, they won't be able to fill the void that the global multilateral order is creating. And I think that's the challenge for us at this point. How do we bridge this gap?
Thanks a lot, Professor. You said you're pessimistic, but I'm an eternal optimist. So I did hear actually that we have a few entry points to overcome the challenges. And for instance, through the functional regional groupings you were mentioning, but also new technology. And again, citizen engagement. I now want to turn to Swati Mehta, who's the program director at for Justice for All at Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Society, which is based at New York University. And Swati has over 20 years of experience working with civil society, UNDP, and justice programs, in particular in Asia. For instance, working with prison officials, lawyers, legal aid institutions, law schools, and in a really people-centered approach. So, Swati, your experience on access to justice is obviously very relevant for today's discussion. Where do you see entry points to rebuild trust in institutions at local, national, but also at global level through this access to justice approach? And can you reflect on how justice links with trust building and share your thoughts on how to renew the global social contract?
Sure, thank you for your question, Friedrich. Good day to everyone, and excuse my throat, I'm not feeling too well, so kindly bear with me. Many thanks also to FPCI and Global Citizen for hosting this very timely and important discussion. I think we've heard enough, and no one would actually disagree that there is this growing trust deficit between people and governments, and between governments at a global level. We see this reflected in heated and divisive domestic debates, or should I say clashes within our countries across the world. At the global level, we witnessed this massive trust deficit, and Professor Pant also mentioned vaccine inequity. We saw this between countries from global south and global north in the recent General Assembly debates. While the countries from global north were genuinely dismayed at what they saw as a lack of support in the Ukraine crisis against imperialism and for a rule-based international order, the countries from global south felt that their life and death concerns on matters like climate change, rising costs of living, and financial crisis were not taken seriously. Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, was mentioned, and she said very clearly that trust is not created when developed countries fail to live up to their promise on climate financing or on ODA, the official development assistance. Similarly, trust between people and governments at national level is not created when when institutions and governments fail to respond to people's needs or deliver public services equitably. So how do we build this trust? How do we renew and strengthen the social contract in a world where inequalities are rising and people are suffering? For this, we need institutions to respond to people's needs and deliver what people need most at the local level. Failing to do this breeds mistrust. Experiences of inequality and injustice breed mistrust. Even before the pandemic, 2/3 of the global population, 5.1 billion people, lacked meaningful access to justice. And when I say access to justice, I don't mean access to lawyers and courts. For us, access to justice means the ability of people to prevent and resolve their common justice problems. It's about accessing drinking water. It could be about issues relating to debt. The problems that people face in their daily lives, how do the people go about preventing and resolving them? And for this, governments must ensure effective and responsive public service delivery, and they must invest in people-centered justice systems, which provide fair outcomes for people, which empower and support them to prevent and resolve their everyday justice problems based on data and evidence. Moving on to a global level, I think much has been said already about the need for a renewed and an inclusive multilateralism, one which is built around principles of solidarity and not competition. This renewed multilateralism has to be different. It cannot be any longer be about only governments and diplomats and UN staff. A renewed multilateralism must put people at the center of its design and solutions and be responsive to the needs of all people, including women and girls, young people, and future generations, while recognizing their diverse needs. There are already several examples of people and countries collaborating across borders towards common goals, whether they be for climate change, regional peace, justice, or equity. And Professor Pant, as well as Secretary General, has mentioned them in our common agenda. There are examples of young people who are making their voices heard through cohorts like Young Justice Leaders, which is supported by Pathfinders, where I work, or the Unlock the Future Coalition, which is supported by UN Foundation. Then there are examples of these multilateral, minilateral groups or coalitions which comprise diverse actors collaborating around clear goals. This includes Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, where I work, and which is a multi-stakeholder coalition of 43 countries, global partnerships, civil society, and private sector coming together to accelerate action around Sustainable Development Goal 16+. There's the Justice Action Coalition, for example, which is again supported by Pathfinders and brings together 21 countries, many civil society organizations, UN entities, regional alliances, young justice leaders, and innovators to discuss ways to close the justice gap. The UN system itself recognizes the need for a renewed multilateralism, which is clear from our common agenda. I think it would be important to mention the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism and the new emergency platform, the Global Crisis Response Group on Finance, Food, and Energy Crises, which are two examples of how Secretary General is trying to find forward-looking solutions. I am mindful of the time. Let me quickly conclude by quoting Gandhi, who said that the world has enough for everyone's need, but not everyone's greed. Let's work towards a world order which seeks to meet all our basic needs and is not driven by our greed. It has to be based on solidarity and must, as the UN Secretary General says, must measure and value what matters most to people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So what we're hearing here is actually that we need results, right? You mentioned, for instance, public service delivery, but also delivering on promises that have been made on the international level and still haven't been met, like the 100 billion in climate finance. And then also the concrete examples of multi-stakeholder coalitions as Pathfinders, which are ways to overcome the very government-focused system we have today. I'm now turning to Hassan Damlouchi, who's a development expert and co-founder of a think tank called Global Nation, which focuses on international cooperation and advocating for more or fairer, effective international system. And he's also the author of The Responsible Globalist, and serves as senior advisor on pandemic through the World Health Organization. Very often, I think public opinion is portrayed as a driver, actually, of mistrust between people and government. But I think you're arguing that actually public opinion is also, or bears the potential to strengthen global public solidarity and global identity, which we are badly lacking today. So Hassan, please tell us more about how we can work with public opinion to come to this global identity.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this really interesting panel. And it's a great point to come in after, Mark Malloch-Brown set out the overview, and then so many of the challenges, but also some interesting ways to overcome them have already been laid out. But what I like most about this debate is just the framing around the idea of a social contract, because that is not how international cooperation has often been viewed. It's been viewed over time and in the theory of international relations as essentially a power game between states and sort of great men, often men, now increasingly some women, who run the world, right? And actually, this idea of a social contract is about people. And so although the idea has been over time that people don't have anything to do with this, we have to acknowledge more and more that the limits as well as the goals of international cooperation are set by the people that it's intended to serve. There's a funny thing about international cooperation where people view it as being very different from other types of cooperation in society. We know instinctively and scientifically that if you want any organization to work well, if you want collaboration to happen, you need to have a bedrock of trust and a sense of belonging in that group. We know that at the level of a business, we know that at the level of a university community, and we also know that at the level of political communities. There isn't a leader in the world who doesn't worry about to what extent do people feel part of this country, and it isn't actively trying to strengthen the sense that we're all in it together as people in this country. In the extreme cases like Iraq, where my family's from, where that phrase and people feel less a part of that country, states collapse. So we know that political communities and collaboration only works when the people feel a sense of identity is not only enough to have some a great leader. And yet when it comes to international cooperation, we imagine that somehow climate change may be solved by countries who see themselves as aliens and enemies. If only we could acknowledge that climate change is important, we may put aside our differences for a moment and collaborate, even when really we don't feel that we have anything in common. That is not the case. That's the bad news. The bad news is we will fail in solving common challenges as a world precisely to the extent that we do not feel that we are all in it together. But the corollary is the positive side. There is an opportunity to collaborate, even across billions of people. And despite being imperfect, like all countries, India and China, as countries that are way over 1 billion people, have shown that it is possible to have a sense of common identity and successful collaborative action across people who do not share necessarily a lot of historical experiences in common. They do not necessarily share languages or religions in common. So the question then is, how do you strengthen a sense of belonging at the global level? Now, it shouldn't be imagined that we could ever create in the world the strength of belonging that you have, maybe even in a huge country like India or China, because it's even another scale of extra complexity and historical divergence. That's okay. The point is, the closer we get to that, the more likely it is that the trade-offs we need to make as a world will be made. And the further we are from that will precisely be the measure of our failure. And so the question becomes, how do you strengthen that? Again, good news, we are not at square zero. We do not live in a world where humanity at large means nothing to people. And there are some really surprising statistics here. I come back to what Mark Malloch-Brown dropped in as this idea that people are often well ahead of their governments. Well, that's absolutely the case. Extraordinarily, a majority of people in every single country surveyed, including Russia, including Turkey, and I give those as examples of countries that have not always felt well served by the international order. The majority of people in all of these countries say that for problems like climate change and the environment, international organizations should have enforcement power. That is an extraordinary willingness to have teeth in the international community. A majority of people, about half of all people in the world, when asked, say that they feel that they're a citizen of the world. And there's way more of those people responding positively to that question in the Philippines and China and India and Nigeria than there are in Germany and Britain and the United States of America. So we do not live in a world whose people embody the same level of dysfunctionality in terms of their belonging to that global community as our politics does. Now, it's very difficult to turn that good news into political change because politics is what it is. But there is the seed of long-term change because public opinion sets the limits of what's possible. You know, Donald Trump leaving the WHO was only possible because he thought he could get some votes. Even with a right-wing agenda, there's a level of divisiveness that would have lost him, all of the votes. The Overton window of what is politically possible moves as certain things become unimaginable and other things become imaginable for the first time. And so the job, I think, here of what Mark Malek Brown talked about, the campaigning role, is to move that over to by gradually nudging us from a time 200 years ago when slavery was tolerated on a mass level to the time we have today where we talk about human rights, where there are flows of foreign aid, way beyond that to a time when we really feel more like we're in it together as a world. And only then can we deliver on things like climate change.
Thanks a lot, Hassan. So what I'm staying with is that actually citizens are ahead of many politicians, and the question is, how do we actually create a sense of belonging, a global identity with our politicians and decision makers? And this is where it goes back to civil society. So great segue into our second round, where we have a few discussants joining us from all over the world, from Indonesia to Jordan to Sweden. And I want to start with Mark Clark, who's a CEO of Generations for Peace, which is a Jordan-based global nonprofit peace-building organization founded by His Royal Highness Prince Faisal Al Hussein in 2007. Mark, what is your perspective here on what can we learn actually from your experience in peace building, maybe also, to change our mindset on global affairs?
Very good. Thank you, Frederica. Thank you to all the speakers. It's been a fascinating conversation already today. Grateful to be part of it. I think we're positioning ourselves really at the grassroots, but we recognize what's been said already, that the global architecture, the system is no longer fit for purpose. The kind of colonial era power structures, I think corporate hijacking of democracies, extreme commercialization of media are sort of pushing us into a post-truth world. We're feeding ourselves from echo chambers, and that in turn is driving greater polarization and sort of populist politics. So these things are going around in the context for civil society actors and indeed citizens and young people. A lot of our work is focused on young people. We're seeing a widening gap between young people and government. There's obviously globally a burgeoning youth demographic, and young people's expectations are not being met. The idea of continued growth is clearly unsustainable. There's very high youth unemployment, more than 52% here in Jordan, for example. And young people also are consuming completely different information to their parents or to their governments. So this widening gap is perhaps also accelerating, based in large part due to social media consumption of information. And that in turn is leading to young people being at least apathetic or outright cynical about their governments and about democratic participation. And we're seeing that in global societies in our country work around the world. So what are we trying to do with Generations Peace programs? We're trying to engage at the grassroots in people-to-people engagement, knowing this is one important ingredient, one piece of the puzzle, and fostering participation at community level, especially youth leadership, to address local issues and effect change in quality of life. We're also really trying to enhance participation and inclusion across identities. So gender, ethnic, tribal, religious identities, but also around displacement, IDPs and refugees. And this is where we come back to the narratives about how people form their identity. So we work also with media professionals and with young people to produce media content. And I think this brings me really to my key question to the speakers. We've surfaced the issue of climate impacts as the existential threat, but can we flip it? Can we really leverage it as the biggest opportunity we've ever had to really drive the types of structural changes that have been identified earlier by our speakers? Can we use collaboration on climate action, collaboration between young people and government to close that gap? Can we use collaboration between governments, between nation states? Can we amend UN structures? And can we create not just a new social contract, but also a new economic vision focused not on GDP growth, but on sustainability? And just to pick up on Hassan's reference to the Overton window, I think my real question from a grassroots perspective back to political leaders is, to what extent are political leaders actually desperate for stronger and louder voices from civil society in order to give them the political mandate to act in a way that they know is right, but is currently constrained by other political interests? Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. And I'm directly going to Sabina Katia, who's joining us from Indonesia, and who's co-founder of Centennial Z, which is a youth empowerment platform. Sabina, over to you.
Okay. Hi everyone, ladies and gentlemen. It was a fascinating conversation. First of all, it is underlined that we have to do something regarding the urgent need to build a new type of global collaboration in achieving fair outcomes for all. I'm suggesting a bottom-up approach by listening to the voices in community and honoring their commitment to create engagement spaces. I agree with Mark before that we have to reach the grassroots first, then we collaborate with the government or the institutions. Okay, I have some thoughts and questions regarding this to maybe Mr. Danilo, Prof. Harsh, and Ms. Swati Mehta. How do you see? If we consider all members of the human race belong to a global society, what kind of global social contract of rights and responsibilities could be constructed to promote its overall welfare? In the absence of a global government, how could it be upheld? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabina. And we have a three discussant, who's Sidalise Shun, joining us from Cambodia and from the American University in Phnom Penh.
Okay, so it's a great honor to be here among you, and it's indeed a privilege to represent as Cambodia citizen and speak on behalf of a lot of incredible leaders. So I try to stick to the task of trying to really just dig in and understand what I've heard and bring out a view of what I think maybe salient points, and whether even this is a fair question just to ask just about yield in isolation of everything else. So all of our excellency panelists had mentioned every particular things that we see, and this is always a problem, and it's always come back to us. And additionally, I find viewpoint of our panelists to be really fascinating because they have outlined many of the issues that we are presently facing and have also provided a remedy in order to establish new global social contract. So ongoing crisis, including the conflict in Ukraine and the civil war in Yemen, Myanmar, witness the international system failures to uphold global peace and global prosperity. And there are enormous obstacles in the world today that prevent those who back for social justice from exercising their fundamental human rights, including being denied access to food, energy, and education because of ongoing conflict. Therefore, in this morning session on democracies versus autocracies, we learned that in Southeast Asia, we cannot apply this to the economy, but I do believe that human rights protection is important. And as I mentioned right now in Myanmar, in our own neighborhood, there is severe violation of international human rights. So my question is, what is the way for us to deliver the correct and most effective global governance in these regions to protect everyone's human rights? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dear panelists, you got actually different questions here, but what I'm hearing across all our discussions is this promise maybe of a bottom-up approach, grassroots collaboration approach, and how this actually can also have then beneficial effects on multilateral governance, and really this need to deliver also on human rights protection, let alone obviously issues like conflict, food security, and so on. I would actually love to hear from all of you. If you can stick to 2 minutes, that would be great. Let's start in the reverse order. So Hassan, do you want to go first? I think you had a specific question here from Mark to you.
Yeah, sorry, could you just remind me the question exactly from Mark?
I think Mark has actually several suggestions and questions, but I think the one specific one was whether actually we need to hear citizens more, or politicians actually need them more, right, to deliver it and to feel the pressure. But there was also, I think, this question of how can we use collaborative approaches that have worked very well at local level for multilateral governance, and also to view the social contract also as something of changing maybe our mindset on how we see actually also economic growth or economic prosperity. Mark is nodding, so I think I got this right. Over to you, Hassan.
Yeah, look, I mean, great questions. They don't lend themselves to a 2-minute answer, but I'll say this, you know, one of the my colleagues, you know, talks about the regionalization and you know, the negative side of that is that I'm only trading with my friends and so on. And it's certainly true that there is a localization going on. And that is, I think, part of a change from a more hegemonic system to one where actually there are many sources of power and influence in the world that are quite well distributed. What I would say is that there's no inherent conflict between stronger local government, national government, regional institutions, and global governance. But we do have to be thoughtful about that. You know, one really good example for me of how regionalization does not necessarily conflict with the world is an example of when, you know, we talked about how the global pandemic response was inadequate, but actually the champion of creating a global vaccine pooled resource was the president of the European Union, a sign that, you know, just because you have got together as a group of countries in Europe does not mean that that group of countries in Europe therefore has to ignore everyone else. It wasn't as successful as we would have liked, but many of these much more autonomous countries, you know, potentially the US, others, were less helpful than this group of countries. So I think entering the world as a region, you know, as Africa is increasingly doing, can actually supplement and contribute to a global cooperation, and then that feeds all the way down. But you know, at the end, you know, it does always come down to the individual citizens. Yes, of course, politicians need their people for this. There's no country in the world. You know, people often say, well, in democracies, there's no country in the world where where politicians aren't both excited about and also scared of, you know, the reactions of their people to things, and you know, even more so arguably in countries that don't have a democratic system for ensuring the mandate. So yes, citizens are, I think, a very underestimated part of that the many layers of collaboration that eventually lead up, to a Secretary General of the United Nations.
Thanks a lot, Hassan. I want to go to Swati, and we did hear a lot about like citizen approaches, local level, grassroots, both bottom up. Obviously, we also have social media today. I think my question is maybe on top of those of the discussions is how can we scale this?
I think there is, and I would also like to, in my response, address some of the points that Mark made. I think there is already, in terms of this bottoms-up approach and listening to voices, and increasing recognition that, voices of young people should be heard, and not just heard to tick some boxes, as often people on this side of 30s and 40s tend to do, but must be a part of the decision-making process. And young people are rightly insisting on this. The power of their voices was so clear at side events at the high-level political forum and the UN General Assembly this year. There are many, many organizations and groups who are supporting now young people. Mark mentioned work that they do. I mentioned that Pathfinder supports a group of young justice leaders or youth change makers from across the world who are working to achieve people-centered justice for all. I also mentioned Unlock the Future Coalition, which is another coalition supported by UN Foundation of youth-led, youth-focused organizations which come together to collaborate and advance impact. I think UN Secretary General has heard voices. There is an envoy on youth. The high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism is specifically mandated to think about how the centrality of women and girls and young people and the needs of future generation are built into this new effective multilateral architecture or structure that they suggest before the next SDG summit. So I think those are things which are happening and which need our push and for us to get together. But if I have some time, Friedrich, I would also like to kind of go back on another point that was highlighted by Mark and also the Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda, which I also alluded to earlier, is about moving beyond how we measure and value and what do we value in terms of global governance? How do we move beyond the current system of GDPs? And, the Secretary General in Our Common Agenda says that, it completely, and he's absolutely right, GDP fails to account for human well-being or the planet's sustainability or non-market services or care. And if our GDPs are rising when we destroy ecosystems or destroying climate, endangering people and planet, then are we really progressing? How do we measure progress? What behaviors do we reward through investment and international support? These are some of the questions that we must answer as we establish a new global and social contract. I'm afraid I don't have more time. I would have loved to address the question on human rights, but I think it's up to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Swati. Well, I think your point on GDP is a very important one, and I think it's also something that's been raised by Prime Minister Mia Mottley, because being focused too much on GDP actually hinders us from actually delivering on results, for instance, supporting countries that are frontline on climate change. Professor Pant, maybe you may want to react to this question of GDP and how it actually hinders us. But there was also the question on how we can actually deliver on human rights protection, I think, which is also a very important one. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Some fascinating points to think about. I would just say that, look, it's, when ultimately all of us are looking for the impact that the bottom-up approach can have on the political stakeholders, so that the policy conversation, the policy debate can move in a direction which I think is more about global community than it is about more narrower communities. And I think it's absolutely essential, and we have seen, I think, as Swati and others have pointed out, is that there is enormous energy, enormous drive, enormous pooling of ideas that is happening at a global level. But I would just add here a bit of a caution that, look, youth is also not a monolith. We talk youth as something that is going to deliver us from all evils. youth is also part of the problem. You know, there are country after country where youth is, where you look at the numbers and they tell you that they are becoming more nationalistic, not less. So I think, you know, we have to be a bit cautious in this idea that somehow global youth is a community, and that is because, you know, technology is also, I think Mark made that point, technology is also having a negative effect of not allowing us to think beyond our echo chambers. Are we reaching out to the other side? I think what is clearly evident in national politics today in many countries is that constituencies are living in their echo chambers. They are not reaching out to the other side, and the polarization at the national and global level is part of that landscape as well. So I think, you know, when we are looking at global solutions or political pressures on leaders, on political systems from the bottom, it is important to acknowledge that there are multiple constituencies out there, and those multiple constituencies are increasingly in a position both for positive and for negative with equal effect. So I think we have to be aware of that pressure, where it is coming from, how that can be mediated, and perhaps a conversation among those who do not see, who are not like-minded. I mean, see, what I'm seeing today is a lot of this idea of like-minded coalitions, and I mentioned this earlier also. But ultimately, if global governance has to be achieved in any significant form, you have to reach out to the non-like-minded. You know, we all can talk amongst ourselves and think, you know, we are working very well because we think alike, but there is a world out there that does not think like us. So what do we do in terms of reaching out to them and convincing them? Are we having those conversations? And is the technology allowing us, giving us a mechanism which is more harmful or more beneficial towards that effect? And I think those are important questions, because ultimately even human rights, look at, you know, the issue of human rights has always been very political. You know, this idea that somehow human rights, there is a particular definition of human rights that have to be applied everywhere. Now we have reached a position to a point where there is a greater global consensus today on certain aspects of human rights. But again, if you look at the pushback by certain nations, by certain communities on human rights, is equally you know, quite extensive. You would think we don't live in 21st century by some of those kind of conversations that you hear. So I think there is a challenge here in terms of the politicization and how do we manage some of the conversations on which we see, on which we are like-minded. There is a growing group of like-minded communities emerging. How do we make sure that that continues to expand and does not become a problem going forward in finding some of the solutions to these problems?
Thank you, Professor. And what I'm hearing here, there are no shortcuts, right? Just talking to those that I already agree with us won't solve challenges like human rights protection, climate change, access to food. Your Excellency, President Türk, over to you. There was a specific question to you, and I think it may allow you also to expand a little bit on the proposals from the Club de Madrid on social inclusion. President, I think you're muted.
Yeah, I will unmute. All right. I am all right. I hope I'm unmuted now. Yes.
We hear you.
Yeah, all right. I try to say that the bottom-up approach, which was discussed in our panels so far, is an important one. And of course, we have to understand that the technology offers new opportunities which have to be used, and that we are still at the early stages of using those opportunities. You see, I was in the UN 2 weeks ago in a discussion on water issues. And obviously, the discussion was very highly influenced by stakeholders who were not government representatives. About 1,200 people participated through various internet-based networks. And that has had an influence. The intergovernmental discussion that followed was much more constructive and much less acrimonious than is usually the case in the United Nations today. So the pressure that comes from the bottom, if I may put it this way, is a relevant factor. And why is it a relevant factor? Because all the political leaders, national and international, are having a need for legitimacy. So this whole concern for legitimacy is a critically important point upon which I think the civil society internationally has to point their finger. That's the question, legitimacy. Are you taking legitimate decisions? Are you proving your legitimacy on a daily basis? That's the pressure that is needed. And I think that there is a fair amount of possibility here for the international civil society to continue with its pressure. Now, if you look at the UN today, it's much more civil society minded than was the case 20 or 30 years ago. It's a different place, and the technology allows that different place to evolve further. So I would use this as a direction. And now, secondly, one also needs specific proposals that come from different segments. I mean, I'm currently representing a group of former presidents, so we build on our political experience. And when we see the problem of poverty rising rapidly as a result of COVID-19, we see this not as a statistical issue. We see this as a deeply political issue as well, to which the international organizations have to respond in order to preserve their legitimacy. And if the UN wants to be legitimate, it has to demonstrate that it cares about rising poverty and that it can articulate policies that will help. Now, we are still far from any, how should I say, agreement on this approach and on policies that are needed, but I think we have to work for that. We started our conversation with this idea of an activist and campaigning agenda. All right, so we have, plenty of things to campaign for. Climate change we discussed, but poverty is a critically important problem, not only for the poor people who suffer, not only for societies which get more and more dysfunctional as a result, but also for the political system which is losing its legitimacy if it is not able to respond to the needs of the people. So that's our approach, and that's why we propose the World Social Summit. That's why the Secretary General has accepted our proposal, and I will, as a member of the High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, continue fighting for it. Yes.
Thank you, President. And I think our next two discussants may also have proposals on how to actually overcome the current structural problems we're facing. And first, I want to go to Bahadir Sihin, who's founder and president of the Global Policy Research Group based in Sweden, Lund. And his think tank has been guided by a desire to deliver actionable policies. So very much music to our ears. Over to you, Bahadir.
Thank you very much for the opportunity and kind invitation. I also want to thank everyone here for sharing their thoughts and ideas. It's a very insightful meeting we're having here. So I actually want to comment on the general sentiment here. I echo the sentiments regarding, regarding the criticism towards the multilateral system that we have, the deficiencies and everything. But I also want to point out one thing and one thing only: understanding the game. So what I'm trying to say here, all the governments, politicians, decision makers, we're always being very critical of them for very, very good reasons. And most of the time, we're always, talking to deficiencies that they bring to the system. But one thing that I also want to perhaps open up for discussion is that how can we build systems, multilateral systems that actually understand the game that has been played in democracy, right? That every politician faces every day, maximizing votes. So this set of incentives, I think, also has created many, many issues for the system that governs the whole world and the countries underneath it. So my question is to Hasan Damluji, to Professor Pant, and His Excellency Donald Turk. How can we build systems that respects the incentives that governments and politicians and decision makers faces every day? Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. And I'm turning to our second discussant in this round, who's Chan-Lok Mankarisa from Hong Kong, from the Asia Law Student Association, which is actually the only students organization jointly run by law students from the different universities in Hong Kong.
Hi everyone, I'm Chan-Lok Mankarisa from Hong Kong. Before I begin, I would like to thank all of you for insightful sharing. So I would like to share some thoughts on the reflection of the Ukraine war on the global energy governance. So like how it addressed extreme fluctuation in energy market and their negative impact caused by the Ukraine war. So Russia is a major player in the global energy market, and this invasion in the Ukraine has undoubtedly rolled the market and geopolitics of the energy, adding on to the economic sanction imposed by Western countries to Russia. And this led to countries thinking how they can sever their energy dependence, where EU import lots of natural gas from Russia. So the first point I'm thinking about is upon the reflection and on demand and supply stability. So affected country may adopt a short-term measure to replace Russian gas from Middle East country. However, this may not be sustainable. The ultimate goal is to stabilize the problem caused by the Ukraine war is the existence of surplus energy supply, and the most efficacious solution would be the self-sufficiency and energy independence. So I would also like to listen to the speakers upon this. The second thought is about the reflection on protecting international energy stability. It is based on international politics or geopolitics. And currently, there are structural changes in international politics, global economy, and international energy market caused by the Ukraine war. So the USA is a key player in developed countries. They have to address international security planning and energy planning with the EU countries affected. Also, it would be great to develop partnership with key suppliers involving commercial supply contracts and potentially wider economic, political, and security links. So my question to the speakers is, what are your thoughts on the Ukraine war and global governance? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Before I go back to the panelists, I would like to add two more questions that we got from the public audience. So the first one actually came to us from Nigeria, from Isinijin Prosper. And the question is a new social contract for the world attainable, especially looking at the unequal representation at the international level? And maybe I just add here, my capacity as moderator, in particular, obviously, the governance of international financial institutions. And then we have a second question from the audience, coming from Indonesia, from Agung Putu, which actually speaks or raises the specific question or the specific role China and Indonesia can play. So China as the regional power in Asia, and Indonesia as the regional power in Southeast Asia. What could these two countries do to avert the current multilateral crisis that we're seeing, that we've experienced with COVID-19, with climate change? Is it time for these countries to abandon a multilateral platform and engage in minilateralism, so this term is back, by forming a small forum that consists of 3 or 4 developing countries who have the same goals and interests? So a lot of questions and food for thought for our panelists. And as we're also nearing the end of our session, I would like to go back to every panelist, and this time starting with President Türk. And I would love for you to address these questions, but also use this as a statement to close off our discussions, and maybe something we can also take away in how we can contribute to building a new social contract. And 2 minutes for every panelist. Thank you. Over to you, Your Excellency.
Well, yes, in the spirit of dialogue, I would like to answer the two questions that were raised. First, on energy and Ukraine, Russia, the Russian aggression in Ukraine, I would say the key is to stop the war. That should be the priority number one. And it is not too early to try. And of course, there can be many ideas and many questions that should be discussed in that context, but the answer clearly is that. Secondly, the role of Indonesia and China. Clearly, Indonesia will have an important role in about a week from now as the host of the G20 summit. That will be an important opportunity for Indonesian diplomacy to demonstrate that there is a global agenda beyond what the current power play suggests. That, I think, is the challenge for the host country. There is a global agenda, a multilateral agenda beyond what the current power play suggests. And we'll see how that works. I'm confident that that Indonesia will demonstrate that ability. And then, obviously, multilateralism is not the only political arena in which things happen. Smaller groups of states can be effective when they propose agendas that are relevant to everybody. And obviously, if China, Indonesia, and other countries come with good proposals that would attract the rest of the world, that would be an important thing to do. Of course, like-mindedness per se, as was discussed in our panel, does not solve much, but like-mindedness can help generating what we say a global social contract, which is a complex matter and will not be achieved overnight. Thank you.
Thank you, President Türk. I'm now turning to Professor Pant. The question of minilateralism, multilateralism is back, and I'm sure you can share a few more thoughts on this.
See, I think the reason it is back is, Friederike, because I think people are looking for alternatives, and the multilateral order is not working, and there is a lot happening in the global governance, regional governance systems. People need institutional frameworks, whether we like them or not. Institutions have a certain role, have a very important role to play in the way we govern ourselves, our systems, our values. And I think that is why we are moving towards this conception of like-minded countries getting together, because it's becoming more and more complex, more and more polarized. So rather than reaching out to the other side, we are trying to figure out where the solutions are possible. Now, a lot of emphasis was laid earlier on I think Hassan was talking about trust and how important that is, and I think that remains at the heart of the problem. That I think major powers today are at a point where they do not trust each other, and especially two big powers of the international system are moving away from each other. So how do we build a multilateral system that responds to that particular inflection point in global politics? And I think Sirine's point is very valid, and I completely agree that ultimately bottom up will have to have an impact on the top down. It will have to have an impact at the top level leadership. And how do we create those incentive structures? It's simplistic to say that Mr. Donald Trump was the problem. There was something happening in the US that reflected his political rise. And still you see Trump may be out of power, but Trumpism is not. We do see Trump saying that he'll come back, at least going to contest once again. So there is something political happening in the US that we have to acknowledge and we have to accept, and we have to try to work with that rather than saying maybe that's a flash in the pan. And that is not simply the US, that is happening in other major countries as well. Domestic politics is churning in many countries, as you know, in Europe, in Asia. And how do you respond to that global governance challenge by keeping that in mind is going to be the question of our times. There is no getting away from that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And I think you're right. Sometimes we want to move on, but I think we need to recognize what the realities are at global level and also within countries. Swati Mehta, over to you. I think there were several questions that will probably resonate with you. And I also had in mind that you wanted to share with us thoughts on human rights protection in particular.
Sure, thank you. But I think I would really like to kind of go back to what Professor Pant was saying, you know, and something that he alluded to, which perhaps is the answer to his last question, which is about, you know, these divisive narratives that are going on and the importance of dialogue with people that we do not necessarily agree with, and the role that the technology is playing in all of this, right? We all hear narratives that we subscribe to. What I see on my Facebook feed or my Twitter feed is the system I believe in. We often don't talk to each other. The divisive narratives have become so bad that we immediately label the others, those who we don't agree with, as fringe, as lunatic, as people we don't want to engage with. And there is no way around actually engaging on these issues and on you know, having dialogues with people. There have been discussions on what do you do in this era of alternate facts and alternate truths? How do we devise ways to check disinformation? Government regulation does not always work very well. Many governments have in fact used hate speech laws and information technology laws to curb dissent. And you know, there are the UN Secretary General, again in Common Agenda, for example, suggests that we perhaps need global or national codes of conducts around ethical conversations and use of you know, technology and internet, which are created in an inclusive and participatory manner, which might help. But the importance of actually engaging with debates is very important, which I think many of us are failing to do and which we perhaps need to do as we move forward. In terms, I don't think I have much time and to talk about in 20 seconds about the human rights issue, but it is, I mean, the fact is that we are kind of organized around sovereign nations. So what happens in Myanmar, where I lived for about 5 years, is that, you know, once the government decides in a particular manner, it's not easy for international organizations or to interfere, which is what the people would have hoped for given the international, you know, human rights order. What we need is, again, people's power, people's ability to push for the change from bottom up, which we see happening in Myanmar, we see happening now in Iran, and that is the only way we kind of make change happen in our context, but also how we go and engage then with the international system and get our voices heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Swati. And Hassan, you're our last speaker.
Great. Well, I couldn't think of a better way to frame my closing comments than with regards to the question that was asked to me, which is, how do we change the incentives of the political decision maker? Because that ultimately is the question, whether it comes to human rights and the last comment that was just made around, you know, it's hard to change what the Myanmar government does. How do we change the political incentives for the decision makers? That is the question. Obviously, it's not something you can fully answer with a thesis in a short comment, but I would say this. We need to look at the lessons of how these things have worked well and badly in the past. And too often, because there's not a lot of history of global governance, we imagine that there's no comparators, but actually there's a lot. So for example, why is it, I mean, I mentioned earlier, you know, India is the size, you know, is not a very different scale of size to the world, right? So India is a fascinating example when you look at a planet-sized community. It's the same size today as the planet was in 1880. So it's a planet-sized country. Why was it that so many parts of the former British Empire decided to join into the country of India? And why was it that you know, there was a popular movement? Yes, there was colonial meddling, but there was a popular movement not to join India for other parts, right? Why was the division happened at some time and a decision to join up that happened at another time? Why is it that Texas, which after it created itself as was an independent state, decided to join the United States of America after having been created independent? Why is it that Britain left the EU and the political decision makers felt that there are incentives to go that way, whereas France and Germany, these historic enemies, actually have stuck it out, and the Union did not fall apart after Brexit. There are so many lessons in what it is that turns the incentives towards or away from the kind of collaborative outcomes that we want, that we can mine for insights into what it would take to build a more collaborative world.
Thank you so much, Hassan, and thanks to all the panelists and discussants for this rich debate. And I'm actually leaving quite uplifted, because I think there is actually a lot of agreement on the need of an activist campaign agenda, as President Türk put it at the start of our session, that we actually have a lot of solutions, historic ones, also at the local level, that we can turn to. While we have to deliver results, and this is the only thing that will eventually deliver trust, we cannot do this without changing the system and also our mindset of how we see, for instance, economic prosperity. So thank you again. And I think even though we want to change the incentive structure, I think what I want to leave all of our audience with is that citizens already have a voice and already have a lot of power on how politicians act. So don't stay silent. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of our global town hall.
Thank you.